Very quickly, I'm just going to say, if my voice sounds a little bit under the weather, that's because I've had COVID for the last week. But that ain't stopping me from talking about House of the Dragon, Episode 1. And I won't go into any major spoilers. Right away to me, the show is pretty good, but it isn't as great yet as Game of Thrones. I know you probably hear that from a lot of other people, but to me, most of the dialogue thus far genuinely didn't wow me from how much of it there was. Two standout lines were Daemon Targaryen calling the small council a council of leeches, and Visser Targaryen calling the Iron Throne the most dangerous seat in Westeros. That line was unexpectedly kind of funny, given that it has a double meaning from the literal sense that it's physically hurting him, and the figurative meaning that everyone's fighting to sit in it. But so far, there hasn't been any banger lines that are immediately quotable like in Game of Thrones. It's primarily the new writers are a lot more competent and consistent at writing than David and Dan. Like, it feels like a miracle to witness almost an hour of dialogue without being bored out of my mind from how bad the dialogue is. Moving a bit more chronologically through the episode, HBO is clearly flaunting their champion purse with all their expensive wide shots with tons of VFX. It's really nice to see a bigger budget on display here, but in a sense, I kind of miss the smaller and grounded scale and more realistic look of Season 1 of Game of Thrones. Because even the cinematography is a lot more dramatic with a harsher contrast. Meanwhile, most of the cinematography in Season 1 of Game of Thrones, it felt a lot more naturalistic and less moody, aiding more to the realism. But these are essentially different styles that work both in their own right. Going back to some introductory scenes, I bet I wasn't the only person who got a little upset when we saw some of the past sets in the Red Keep. Like, it made me kind of depressed when I was reminded where this was where Jamie and Cersei were about to get smushed by bricks. Moving on though, since that's kind of just me nitpicking, the introductions for the characters, relationships, and the general backgrounds felt inconsistent. Like, the opening of the show starts with immediate narration, which in of itself was a bit of a shock since Game of Thrones never utilized that, since it kind of breaks that realism with non-diegetic sound. But I can definitely excuse it here, since it's really hard to communicate where we are in the history of Game of Thrones. However, my main gripe with the introductions in House of the Dragon comes from the fact that the creators essentially throw us into the deep end by starting with a small council meeting. Now, for people who already know who these characters are, like myself, that wasn't really an issue. But this is Westeros. There are hundreds of characters, and casual viewers will be having a hard time understanding who is who. The creators did a great job in setting up relationships, like the feud between Otto Hightower and Daemon Targaryen, but there's still a lot that wasn't introduced. A natural comparison to draw from would be the first episode of Game of Thrones. Through Robert Baratheon coming to Winterfell, our POV characters along with the audience are learning who these people are. But in House of the Dragon, we don't really get that luxury, and we only briefly hear each character's name once or twice. At the end of the day, this isn't a major issue, but I asked my friends who watched the premiere with me if they knew most of the people who weren't Targaryens by the end of the episode, and they had a lot of trouble identifying them. House of the Dragon, though, does a good job in developing their key players early on. Characters like Viserys, Daemon, Rhaenyra, Alicent Hightower, and Otto Hightower all get strong character development, and we quickly know the relationships between all of them. That's definitely a strength the episode has. It's just most of the side characters can fall by the wayside without much acknowledgement, so when they do get acknowledged, you are immediately confused as to who they are and why they matter. I'm assuming this won't persist as an issue given that through the episodes we'll get more development for them. It's just a little weird the writers didn't come up with a natural way to introduce us to everyone. Looking at Rhaenyra, there's a specific moment in the very beginning where she's on her dragon, in which the music clearly plays Daenerys' theme with a little bit of changes. Now, this got me a little worried, because firstly, I don't want them to reuse a lot of themes from Game of Thrones, and secondly, they seem to be trying really hard to mold Rhaenyra after Daenerys. And that was made really apparent when they used her theme with a slight alteration when she was on her own dragon. I want her to stand out on her own more because the creators seem to be obsessed with Dany, given that even in the opening sequence of titles, they mention her. I know it's kind of hard to not make her similar to Daenerys, since Rhaenyra is also breaking the wheel in her own way, but you need to differentiate a bit more. And it's nice that we get a lot of down-to-earth scenes with her and Alicent to help with that. Then we have Daemon Targaryen, which Matt Smith so far is doing a great job. It's just a tad bit awkward to see him balls deep in a woman after watching him for years in Doctor Who, but that's just me. Left a bit of a weird off-putting feeling in my mouth, but for other fans, maybe it's what they've always dreamed of. In terms of Daemon as a character though, I hope the writers try to paint him more as a protagonist in future episodes. Because right now, it feels like he's a straight up antagonist. Because it feels like the writers did Daemon dirty by immediately having him execute and maim a bunch of criminals. Which, criminals I might add, that weren't even shown as being criminals. It came across as Daemon terrorizing the locals and is a menace to society. I like his more tender relationship with Rhaenyra, given that it at least showcases some of his good side. I hope the writers make this like a civil war scenario in which both sides are right and justified. It just depends on their perspective. But I hope they don't lean too heavily on him being a flat out bad guy and this turns into a black and white conflict. Because the second you go that route, the conflict becomes more stale. For Visser Targaryen, I want to talk about the best scene, which was to me, the birth scene. The choice he has to make and the entire conflict of that scene was staggering and was some excellent writing. On top of the fact that this was all intercut with a jousting tournament, and this was by far the peak of the episode. If they can deliver scenes like this consistently, then I think they can match Game of Thrones from an emotional standpoint and a dramatic standpoint. And going back to the jousting tournament, the budget here is on great display, most of the time. The shot of Daemon Targaryen sliding on the bar as he falls off his horse was stunning, and it seems like they even paid homage to Oberyn Martell getting his head smashed open. The only thing that bothered me in this scene, which I doubt was a budgetary issue and is probably more stylistic, which was the excessive cutting during the fight between Daemon Targaryen and Sir Criston Cole. Because surely if the budget was big enough, they'd be able to afford longer takes. Or it could be Miguel Sapochnik. Because in the past, he has shown that he likes his action to be a bit more chaotic by cutting more frequently, and every now and then he'll throw in a longer take to give the audience a break from the relentlessness of the edit. I hope this doesn't continue in later action scenes because I want it to be more coherent. And this could be a limitation from the people being in heavy armor, so that could be the reason for shorter takes. The overall jousting tournament though, besides that one moment, was very good and the practical stunts were extremely impressive. Again, the higher budget is working wonders. Then for one other character I want to talk about before going into the ending, we have Otto Hightower. Although he didn't get as much screen time as other characters, Rhys Ifan, who plays the character, was entrancing. He feels like he perfectly fits into the DNA of Game of Thrones, like a corrupt Littlefinger that is more powerful and hardened. In almost every shot, the actor shows so many subtleties to be picked up on, and so far I can't take my eyes off him. He essentially feels like a mix of Tywin and Littlefinger, which seems like an absolute dream come true. Then for the ending, I won't go into major spoilers, but there's a development they set up that impacts the Targaryens as a whole, and connects back to the Song of Ice and Fire. Which, the development makes sense, but it feels like it only exists to make Rhaenyra seem even more like the lead protagonist. I wasn't able to get through the book since it was primarily just a maester talking about past events, so I don't know if this was a change that was made, because it feels like it is. And I can be wrong. Anyways, I'd give the introductory episode about a 7 to an 8. Thank you for watching and let me know your thoughts on the first episode of House of the Dragon.